I don't usually hike alone, but that weekend, the forest seemed like the only place that could silence my racing mind. Work had been overwhelming, my personal life even more so, and I needed space. Real space, where the only sounds were rustling leaves and distant birdsong. I parked my car at the edge of the old trailhead just before noon. The map I had downloaded onto my phone showed a few marked paths, but I wasn't interested in staying on the beaten track. After about an hour of walking, I veered off the trail and headed deeper into the forest, the sun filtering through the canopy in golden beams. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No hikers, no distant highway hum, just the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the rhythmic crunch of leaves. It was almost by accident that I found the cemetery. I'd been following what looked like a faint deer trail when the trees began to thin. At first, I noticed just one, a single headstone leaning slightly, moss creeping up its surface, then another, half buried in the dirt, and another after that. Within moments, I was standing in a clearing that stretched out in uneven rows of graves. The headstones were old, many of them cracked or worn down to illegibility. Some were nothing more than jagged pieces of stone poking through the earth, as if the forest had been slowly trying to reclaim them. There was no fence or gate, nothing to mark the boundary of this place. It felt abandoned, forgotten. A breeze stirred, carrying with it a faint metallic tang, and I shivered despite the warmth of the day. I didn't know why, but something about the clearing felt wrong, as if I were trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. I stepped closer to one of the headstones. The name was eroded beyond recognition, but I could still make out a date near the bottom. 1843. My curiosity flared, pushing aside the unease. I wandered deeper into the graveyard, my eyes scanning the stones for anything legible. Some had crude carvings, symbols I didn't recognize. Others bore faint, looping script that looked almost like it had been scratched in a hurry. Then I saw it. A stone, larger than the others, set upright in the center of the clearing. Unlike the rest, it seemed untouched by time. No moss, no cracks, just smooth, dark granite, as if it had been placed there yesterday. My pulse quickened as I approached it, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Carved into the surface was a list of rules. 1. Never walk between the graves after sunset. 2. If you hear footsteps, do not look back. 3. Do not touch the trees within the cemetery. 4. If a grave is open, leave immediately. I stared at the words, a hollow feeling growing in my chest. Rules? For a cemetery? It had to be some kind of local legend or a prank left behind by previous visitors. But when I glanced around at the empty clearing, I saw no signs of recent human activity. No footprints, no trash, just silence. So deep, it pressed against my ears. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, but another part, a deeper, instinctual part, felt compelled to take those rules seriously. The air here was different, heavier. I backed away from the stone, feeling the urge to leave before I lost the daylight. My watch read 3:45 p.m. Enough time to explore a little longer, I thought. But as I turned back toward the graves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. The sun hung lower in the sky as I wandered through the clearing, its golden light casting long, eerie shadows across the uneven ground. The rules etched on that smooth, unyielding stone stayed fresh in my mind. I told myself they were just a quirky relic of some long-forgotten tradition, but something about their presence made me uneasy. They felt less like guidelines and more like warnings. I continued to explore, stepping carefully over twisted roots and around the crumbling gravestones. The further I ventured, the stranger the markings became. One grave bore a symbol that looked like an eye, scratched deep into the surface. Another had jagged lines radiating out from a central point, almost like a sunburst. I took a photo with my phone, though the growing dimness made it hard to capture much detail. As I examined the carvings, I realized how quiet it had gotten. The birdsong that had accompanied me earlier had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the breeze seemed to have died, leaving the air thick and still. My pulse quickened as I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't loud, just faint, almost tentative, as though someone was moving carefully over the leaf-strewn ground. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I I turned my head slightly, listening intently. The steps came again, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Another hiker? But there had been no sign of anyone else for miles. I called out, my voice breaking the silence like a whip. Hello? Is someone there? The footsteps stopped. My skin prickled as I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was probably an echo, the sound of my own steps bouncing back from the trees. But as I stood there, motionless, I heard them again. Faint, deliberate, coming from behind me. Rule 2. If you hear footsteps, do not look back. I clenched my jaw, my heart hammering in my chest. It was ridiculous. A stupid rule on a stupid rock. But something about the way the air felt, heavy and electric, made me hesitate. I wanted to turn to confirm there was nothing there, but my legs refused to move. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, from somewhere far too close, I heard the faint rustle of leaves, like something brushing past them. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. A low, metallic creak broke the tension. I spun toward the sound and saw it. One of the graves. Its stone lid shifted slightly ajar. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. The lid was covered in moss and dirt, but the opening was clean. The edges sharp, as though it had been moved recently. The dark void inside seemed to pulse, drawing my gaze in despite my growing fear. Rule 4. If a grave is open, leave immediately. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. The shadows around me felt alive, closing in from all sides. My breaths came fast and shallow as I turned and hurried toward the edge of the clearing, ignoring the way the trees seemed to shift and sway in my peripheral vision. When I finally broke through the tree line and back onto the trail, the weight in my chest lifted slightly. I glanced at my phone, 5:47 p.m. The sun was almost gone, and the shadows of the forest stretched long and dark. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. As I climbed in and locked the doors, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The cemetery was behind me, but the rules still echoed in my mind, louder now, as though they had been seared into my memory. I didn't sleep much that night. My dreams were a chaotic blur of shadows shifting between gravestones, whispers echoing through the trees, and the sound of footsteps always just out of reach. I woke up drenched in sweat, the rules carved into that stone replaying over and over in my head like a warnings I couldn't ignore. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or curses, and yet I couldn't let it go. The memory of that grave, open, dark, and impossibly clean, gnawed at me. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to go back. It was late afternoon when I reached the trailhead again. The sun hung low, bathing the forest in a hazy orange glow. I hesitated at the edge of the trees, the weight of what I was about to do settling in my chest. "This is stupid," I muttered under my breath. But curiosity, or maybe something stronger, pulled me forward. The walk felt longer this time. The forest was quieter, as if the whole place were holding its breath. When I finally reached the clearing, the sight of the cemetery sent a shiver down my spine. It looked the same as the day before, yet somehow different, darker even in the fading daylight. I made my way to the central stone, my eyes scanning the graves for any changes. Most were as I had left them, but when I reached the far edge of the clearing, I stopped cold. Another grave was opened. This one was older. The stone lid cracked and tilted to the side. The air around it felt colder, and a faint acrid smell rose from the dark void. My first instinct was to leave, but my feet remained planted. Against my better judgment, I crouched down, peering closer. There was something inside. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. Faint carvings on the walls of the grave, symbols similar to the ones I'd seen on the headstones. They looked ancient, intricate, as if they had been etched with deliberate precision. My phone's flashlight flickered as I tried to take a picture, the beam barely cutting through the gloom. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. They were louder this time, deliberate, echoing across the clearing. My heart leapt into my throat. Rule 2. If you hear footsteps, do not look back. The memory of those words burned in my mind. but my instincts betrayed me. Slowly, I turned. At first, I saw nothing, just the gravestones, silent and unmoving. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught it. A shadow slipping between the trees. It was quick, too quick to be human, and yet it moved with purpose. My breathing quickened as I scanned the tree line, desperate to see what was out there. A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Low, guttural, almost mocking. I backed away from the open grave, my legs shaking. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around me as the shadows seemed to grow taller, darker. I didn't need another sign. I turned and ran, the rules flashing through my mind like a mantra. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't break the rules. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I paused, glancing over my shoulder one last time. The shadows near the open grave shifted, coalescing into a shape, tall, humanoid, and wrong. It stood motionless, its head tilting slightly, as if watching me leave. I didn't stop running until I was back at the trailhead, my chest burning and my lungs gasping for air. As I climbed into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, stretching toward the road like grasping fingers. This wasn't over. Whatever was in that cemetery wasn't just staying there. It had noticed me, and it didn't want me to leave. By the fourth day, the cemetery felt more like an obsession than a discovery. I tried to focus on work, on normal life, but my thoughts always circled back to that clearing in the woods. The rules, the open graves, the shadows, it all gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I even meant it. But when the sun began to set, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest again. This time, I brought a flashlight and a small notebook. If I was going to return, I needed to document what was happening. I told myself that if I could understand the cemetery, its rules, its strange power, I could make sense of the fear that had taken root in me. The forest was darker than before. Clouds had rolled in, shrouding the moonlight, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. Each step felt heavier, the air thicker. By the time I reached the clearing, my chest was tight, and my skin prickled with an uneasy awareness. The cemetery greeted me with its familiar stillness, but something was different. The shadows between the graves seemed to shift, as if they were alive. The central stone with the rules stood untouched, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the etched letters, as if touching them would make them more real. Never walk between the graves after sunset. If you hear footsteps, do not look back. Do not touch the trees within the cemetery. If a grave is open, leave immediately. I glanced around the clearing, my flashlight casting long beams of light across the headstones. The open grave I'd seen the day before was still there, its edges sharp and unnatural. But now, a second grave was ajar, its lid tilted slightly as though someone, or something, had disturbed it. My heart thudded painfully as I backed away. The rules were no joke. They were a warning, a survival guide, and I had broken them by coming back. The first sound was faint, barely audible, a low rustle, like leaves shifting in a breeze. But there was no wind. Then came the footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoing across the clearing. My flashlight wavered as I gripped it tightly, scanning the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just behind me. Rule 2. If you hear footsteps, do not look back. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath shallow and fast. I could feel the presence behind me, its weight pressing against the air, its coldness seeping into my skin. The urge to turn was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to stay still. Then, a voice, low, familiar, and wrong. Tom. My blood turned to ice. It was my mother's voice. She'd been dead for years, but it was her tone, her inflection, calling my name in a way that made my chest ache. Tom, look at me. Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head, clinging to the rule like a lifeline. You shouldn't have come here, the voice said, harsher now. You've broken the rules. The footsteps moved, circling me slowly, each one deliberate. My legs trembled, but I stayed rooted. my grip on the flashlight so tight it hurt. Finally, the voice faded, replaced by the sound of something brushing against the trees. Rule 3: do not touch the trees within the cemetery. I turned my flashlight toward the nearest tree, and my stomach lurched. The bark was wet and dark, as though something had been dragged across it. The ground beneath it was disturbed, roots poking through the soil in twisted patterns. The shadows between the graves began to shift again, coalescing into shapes, tall, humanoid, and wrong. They didn't move like people, but they weren't entirely still either, their forms flickering in and out of focus. I backed away, my flashlight trembling as I tried to keep them in sight. One of the shapes turned toward me, its head tilting unnaturally. A faint, guttural sound escaped it, a mix between a growl and a sigh. I stumbled, nearly falling, and bolted for the tree line. The forest felt alive around me as I ran, the branches clawing at my clothes, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, my chest heaving and my legs shaking. When I finally looked back, the shadows at the edge of the forest seemed to linger, watching. I climbed into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Whatever was in that cemetery, it was growing stronger. The rules weren't just about staying safe, they were about keeping something contained. And now I had a terrible feeling that the boundary between the two was starting to blur. I didn't go to work the next day, or the day after that. The shadows of the cemetery haunted my every thought, their unnatural movements seared into my memory. The rules played on a loop in my mind, their simplicity masking the deep, existential dread they carried. I knew better than to return, but that only made the pull stronger. So by the third evening, I couldn't resist any longer. This wasn't curiosity anymore, it was compulsion. I packed a flashlight, a notebook, and a small hunting knife. Though I doubted the blade would help against whatever was in that clearing, I just needed to know, to understand, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The forest seemed darker than ever, the trees looming like silent witnesses to my foolishness. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had set completely, plunging the cemetery into a deep, suffocating black. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beam weak and jittery. The clearing was still, but it wasn't empty. Another grave had opened. This one was larger than the others, its lid shattered into jagged pieces around the gaping hole. A faint light seeped from within, pale and sickly, casting eerie shadows across the nearby headstones. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though the ground itself was exhaling something ancient and foul. I should have left right then. The rules were clear. If a grave is open, leave immediately. But the light drew me in, beckoning me closer. My feet moved out of their own accord, carrying me to the edge of the grave. Inside, the carvings on the walls were more intricate than anything I'd seen before. They pulsed, faintly, the light emanating from their depths. Symbols I couldn't begin to understand spiraled across the surface, converging at the bottom of the pit where something glinted in the weak light. I leaned closer, my flashlight trembling as I focused on the object. It was a mirror, small, circular, its frame made of dark, tarnished metal. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and wrong. My eyes were hollow, my mouth slightly open, as if caught mid-scream. A shiver ran through me, and I stumbled back, almost losing my footing. Then came the footsteps. Louder this time, faster. They echoed from every direction, surrounding me in a cacophony of sound. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out as the shadows between the graves began to move. The first shape emerged near the central stone, its tall, angular form gliding unnaturally over the ground. Others followed, their bodies twisting and flickering as they surrounded the clearing. My heart pounded as I backed away, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. One of them stepped forward, its head tilting as it fixed me with an eyeless gaze. Its voice was low, guttural, and inhuman, but the words it spoke were clear. "You broke the rules?" The light from the grave flared, casting the shadows in sharp relief. The figures moved closer, their limbs stretching and bending in impossible ways. I turned and ran, weaving between the graves, my mind racing through the rules. Never walk between the graves after sunset. My chest tightened as I realized what I was doing. I was breaking another rule, The footsteps followed, faster now, almost frantic. My flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The shapes closed in, their guttural voices blending into a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I reached the edge of the clearing, my hands grasping at the nearest tree for balance. The bark was cold and wet, and a jolt of fear shot through me as I remembered Rule 3. Do not touch the trees within the cemetery. A sharp, burning sensation shot up my arm, and I yanked my hand away, stumbling onto the trail. The shadows stopped at the edge of the clearing, their forms melting into the darkness. But the pain in my arm didn't fade. When I looked down, I saw a dark line spreading across my skin, branching out like veins. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slammed the door shut and locked it. My arm ached, the black veins pulsing faintly beneath my skin. Whatever was in that cemetery, it wasn't just a danger to those who entered. It was a poison, spreading beyond its borders. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, its head tilted, watching me leave. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow in my apartment felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of adrenaline through my chest. My arm throbbed where the black veins had spread, a reminder that I hadn't left the cemetery unscathed. No matter how many times I washed it, the lines wouldn't fade. They were inside me now, pulsing faintly with each beat of my heart. By morning, I convinced myself it was over. I had escaped. Whatever was in that clearing would stay there, bound by the rules I had so carelessly broken. But as the day wore on, the shadows in my peripheral vision grew darker, longer, twisting unnaturally. The rules weren't just for the cemetery, they were for me now, a bond I had unknowingly entered. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my notebook. The pages were filled with frantic, disjointed notes, descriptions of the graves, sketches of the symbols, transcriptions of the rules, but none of it made sense. No pattern emerged, no logic I could cling to. The only thing I knew for certain was that the cemetery wasn't just forgotten, it was waiting. I should have gone to the hospital, told someone about the lines spreading up my arm, but deep down, I knew no doctor could help me. This wasn't a sickness. It was something worse. As the sun began to set, the shadows in my apartment deepened. My phone buzzed on the counter and I jumped. My nerves frayed. The screen showed a single notification. You broke the rules. My blood ran cold. The message had no sender, just those 4 words. I dropped the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I picked it up again, the notification was gone. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger. I locked every door and window, pulling the curtain shut. The rules echoed in my mind, louder now, as though the cemetery itself was reminding me of what I had done. My hand shook as I wrote in my notebook, desperate to make sense of it all. The rules are not suggestions. The cemetery doesn't forgive. The boundaries are not permanent. The words blurred as my vision faltered, exhaustion pulling at me. I forced myself to stay awake, my ears straining for any sound, and then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from the hallway outside my apartment. Then they grew louder, closer, each step deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, the light beneath it flickering as though something was moving on the other side. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft knock. Slow, steady. I didn't move. Rule 5. If you hear knocking, ignore it. But this wasn't the cemetery. This was my home. Tom, a voice called, soft and familiar. My chest tightened. It was my mother's voice again, the same haunting tone I had heard in the clearing. Let me in. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to respond. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, shaking the door on its hinges. Tom, you can't run forever, the voice said, now deeper, more guttural. You belong to us. The light beneath the door went out. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. My heart pounded in the darkness as I waited, every second stretching into eternity. Then, without warning, the door burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and featureless, its shadow stretching across the room like a living thing. The black veins in my arm burned as the figure stepped closer, its movements impossibly smooth. My flashlight was on the table, but my hands were too unsteady to reach for it. All I could do was stare as it leaned forward, its head tilting unnaturally. "You broke the rules," it whispered, its voice like a dozen overlapping tones. "And now you will keep them." The room spun as the figure reached out, its shadow engulfing me. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my reflection in the window, distorted, hollow, and no longer my own.